pleasure of being the last panel. Good news is drinks are shortly following, or immediately following, I should say. So we're going to talk a little bit about InsurTech and how it affects what's happening in sort of the insurance, reinsurance sphere. I'm joined here by some great panelists. Really looking forward to hearing what their thoughts are and what they have to share. Just going in order here, Will Dove is the CEO of Extraordinary Re. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things he's seeing. Paul Mang is the CEO of Global Analytics for Aon. And George Woods, who's the SVP Global Strategic Advisory for Guy Carpenter. So, you know, they've been on all sides of the InsurTech space and really about making it real and be able to share some pragmatic examples of what opportunities this creates, but also how you address a lot of the challenges associated with it. Just to kick off, since we're sort of closer to the end of the day, I'm going to give just a brief sort of summary of some of the things that are really happening in InsurTech, and then we'll dive right into the panel. But you know, interestingly, if we go to the first slide, I've a little bit of background about myself. So I lead insurance advisory for PwC, but probably more importantly, more germane to this topic is I've spent my career looking at how information and technology are changing the competitive strategies of the insurance sphere. But most interestingly is I actually come from an Amish family. And for those who know anything about the Amish, the two things they don't have are insurance and technology. So I quite frankly, I might possibly be one of the best Amish insurance technologists you've ever met. So that's my real claim to fame and why I obviously have built a career in looking at how those things come together. But interestingly, it's not that surprising that I come from that background and have really found my niche in that space. These are actual pictures from my hometown, Arthur, Illinois, a little small town, and I feel like it's a motto that we have really in the insurance industry. A town of progress where time stands still. And you know, so people look at InsurTech and say, well, you know, there's nothing new. There's nothing I haven't already thought of, or this is just some of the same models. And I think it misses the point about just as technology and information really improves, it isn't so much that something's going to totally disrupt or change and be something you've never ever thought of. It's that you can present a lot of the same models that are there in new and different and exciting ways, and it opens up and unlocks new possibilities of what's there. If you go to the next slide, and so we've always been at sort of the hotbed of innovation. And this is a true story. My cousins would fall asleep or pass out in the back of a buggy, and the horse would drive them home. So the original autonomous vehicle, I like to say Google's just now catching up. And you know, and as models of innovation, it doesn't stop there. So you know, this hotbed, obviously the center of real innovation for centuries. If we go to the next slide, you know, so barn raising is crowdsourced claims and a true peer-to-peer insurance model, not some of the fake ones that people put out there in different ways. Truly is sort of peer-to-peer. So the big problem is they couldn't scale. So technology allows you to scale capabilities in these new business models in interesting ways. And that essentially is really kind of what's happening in sort of the InsurTech space. Now if you go to the next page, and what you see is, unlike in the past, it's less about these sort of models that say, is it going to disrupt and a new entrant going to take out various players that are there? What we really have is unprecedented levels of innovation, so capital and talent being deployed and aimed at all the capabilities across the insurance value chain. So while we used to build all the capabilities ourselves, many of us would look at our own IT organization and say, do we really have the best talent in the world working on the problems that we have? Are we really sort of best equipped? And now you have things that are happening not just within sort of the traditional sort of carriers and insurers, but also happening outside of it, and little pieces of it, just improving efficiency and effectiveness on capabilities as we look across it. So we've moved from this model of sort of a disruption to really how are you actually, how is it transforming different parts of what's possible? So in the same way, it's not models that didn't already exist, it's new ways that you can do things and do it in different ways. So we see things happening across every bit of that. We go to the next slide, and I think this gets to something, our latest research that we do every year around the InsurTech space with executives around the globe, while in the past there was this notion of will it disrupt us, as we see here, a huge percentage of folks, almost everybody is looking at some way around how do they better monitor, how do they actually engage in partnerships with the InsurTech players. How are they looking to establish and tap into the participation on some of the development of those innovation capabilities. So this pendulum sort of swung to sort of more of a norm of this is really about how we partner, how we tap into and exploit some of the things that are possible in a new and better way. So I think a lot of the hype went to some of the disruptive aspects in the players. I think that's the attention of media. I do think 99% of those things that are being done are about how we really use information and other things effectively. So, with that, I'm gonna go quickly to a poll, and then we'll dive into to our panelists, and they'll talk a lot about some of those changes that we're seeing. So I'll ask each of you to respond. We have a polling question here, looking to get your response of which part of the reinsurance value chain do you believe is likely to be disrupted or innovated by the impact of InsurTech. So just take a minute here. This, ranging from sort of distribution to underwriting, new product development, claims, and then operational efficiency.
Those are great pictures.
All right, do we have our answers? All right, I owe Paul $1. All right, so more than half of respondents said that distribution and the elimination of information asymmetry, and so the reason for the joke there is Paul said it's always distribution. Everybody always answers distribution, and given that's where he plays, I'm not sure he fully agrees, but I'll start with Paul just to when you see sort of the response. Can we put the responses back up here really quickly? So what's your view of sort of the responses, and how do you feel take that?
Some pride in being able to estimate that it was going to be close to 60%.
That's the analytics. I mean, he did a big study.
Well, it's if you've been in and around the InsurTech space or been going to any of these conferences, usually the distribution part, you walk around with a big bullseye on your back, and it's a logical place to start. There might be a second order question: where will be the real value? Like what will have sustainable value? And there may be a different response there. I think all of it will be the target of some new ideas, and it will change the dynamics. But no, it doesn't surprise me. And there's work to be done, and technology can manage this. Part of the reason why this has happened, I think, is unlike Will, the original innovators and entrepreneurs who got into the industry, they came from other sectors where that was the key thing, like finding a book or finding an airline at the right price. And so there's a logical spillover effect of the first wave of entrepreneurs. It seemed like the low-hanging fruit, and that's where things got started. So over time, when you do this next year, it'll probably come down to about 54%.
A decade will be at 47.
Yes, yes.
So, George, what's your sort of response?
Well, yeah, I think that the way I see it is a lot of times people immediately say, okay, what's the low-hanging fruit? And it always seems to be distribution. And one of the questions that comes to mind is when people responded to this, when they think about distribution, are they thinking about the reinsurance broker, or are they thinking about an MGA? Yes, in terms of when I think about technology and what I've seen out there, MGAs especially, if you have MGA that's on a digital platform, then they've been able to leverage that technology and been able to actually, in my opinion, be more efficient in terms of how they operate. But I also feel that, and I will disagree because I walk around a target on my back, that when it comes to more complex risk, you have brokers and agents that are of value. They're like the risk managers for their particular clients. So I don't see them going away.
Agree. So I'm going to change a little bit. I'm not going to ask you to respond to the different piece, but similarly, I mean, I think irrespective, this is where people most likely see, and as I mentioned earlier and showed, there are activities and investments happening across every aspect of the value chain and in every function in terms of how you look at this. So, you know, we think about some of the opportunities that this new sort of technology may provide. You know, I'm struck earlier, I think it was Dan Brookman from Excel, talked about sort of the new structures being key to unlocking growth, right? So the part of industry and sort of the new pieces. I mean, this is sort of the perfect sort of tee up for you, and obviously at Extraordinary Re, this is what, you know, you've been all about, so.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, my own background, I'm a little bit unusual as an InsurTech CEO in that, you know, I spent 30 years in the global insurance and reinsurance business, kind of working inside big organizations, dealing with underwriting and risk issues, and seeing firsthand some of the challenges that, you know, even the most sophisticated carriers face in packaging and transferring risk to the capital markets when it doesn't fit into a cat bond wrapper. And so, you know, Extraordinary Re's vision is to build the first trading platform for a full range of insurance risks to give insurers and reinsurers a new way to access capital markets capacity, but also a new way for, you know, ILS investors and ultimately other kinds of institutions to take on insurance risk in a tradable format where they can customize their own portfolios and manage them as they would in other asset classes.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to, you know, again, in one of the panels earlier, it was about matching that underwriting with sort of the capital, right, and creating a real mechanism to do that. Right? And now sort of technology has provided that capability, which I think is, I mean, that to me is real innovation, right, and something that's sort of near and dear to what our industry is really about. So George, turn to you, and we look at some of the opportunities. You know, we also heard a little bit about, you know, sort of, you know, asking for, you know, for price, for rate increases, and some of the challenges with asking for more, and why that can be really difficult. But there's also an opportunity of innovation to actually help bring sort of, or impact the offerings and what you can bring to the customers. So you can ask for rate, but can we also sort of enhance the offerings that are there? I know you've done some thinking in this, and ask you what you're seeing.
Yeah, so, you know, what I'm seeing, especially in the InsurTech space, you have some reinsurers that are really diving in and in some cases partnering with some of these InsurTech companies. And what they're able to do by partnering, you know, for example, let's say they partner with a drone company. They're able to then partner with this company, learn about drones, learn about the technology, and then also to learn about what kind of impact it has or what kind of effect it may have from a product development standpoint. Maybe they need to create some type of drone liability product can come out of that. Another thing too that I find is you'll see some companies investing in IoT. Internet of Things, for those of you who don't know what IoT means. And what you see there is some companies are investing in that because you have carriers that, for example, maybe insure machinery and equipment. And what happens is when you now have IoT where equipment has sensors in it already, does the equipment actually break down, or does it become more of a warranty because it's a maintenance concern? So those are some of the things that I'm seeing out there.
All right, great. So, you know, Paul, I'll turn to you in sort of the space, right? Sort of the CEO analytics. You know, you're sort of at the fore, sort of, you know, what I think is the most innovative activities in the last many decades, and that is their ability to capture, consume, interpret, use information and new data sources, new techniques. But, you know, we were talking earlier, you know, a lot of the talk is sort of data as the new oil, right? But, you know, have we really gotten better? Right? What's some of your take on that? Or we just gotten oily?
I mean, that comment, data is the new oil, I'm sure people have heard that, right? You hear it at every single conference. And I'm of two minds when I hear something like that. The positive thing is there's much more attention internally that data is an enterprise level asset. It isn't, you know, kept to a practice or a relationship. Because sometimes what's in the manila folder was really your source of power within an industry. And so the positive side of data as new oil is that there's a recognition that it has value and we could be a better consultant or a better broker. But there's a real downside of that phrase. I think the downside is some of our trickiest problems that have been talked about in prior panels is a lot of the problems of the emerging risk have huge network implications. You know, whether it's supply chain, whether it's pandemic, you know, food supply, food safety, cyber, they've got all these network implications. And we're only going to resolve that with the ability to collaborate in some way, work with the modeling companies, work with technology companies. But once people said the words, data is the new oil, it essentially shut down collaboration. Because everyone's worried about their oil. And every time someone comes to you and says, well, we could do this if we put it into some platform, the word platform comes out, everyone's worried about, well, their oil. And so when you go back to your business, what do you find? We can't collaborate with them because we want to be the owner of the platform. So the irony of this is an industry that has collaborated in the past. We've created platforms like the Lloyd's Syndicate model. We've created contributory databases. Those of you in the United States know that UL Labs, Underwriter Laboratories, those were a group of underwriters who decided we're not going to have fires in every home when they invented electricity. Those are collaborative efforts that happened in an era where we didn't have this term, data is the new oil. Once data became the new oil, people are looking for oil within their organization and struggling with getting their data organized in data lakes, and all that's happening. And we will be able to tackle, I'd say, some small sounds like it's a trivial task. I mean, that's a complicated task, and we will gain efficiencies from doing it. But if we're going to regain relevance, we're going to go after the biggest problems that society has, including the protection gap, including some of these intangible assets. We have to create a model where we have more comfort and understanding of how do we get into networks. And it's a two-edged sword. It has increased attention to the area that I spend a lot of time in, so people take data more seriously. But it has become a challenge because when you say that, people want to hold on to their oil. They have a fiduciary, they have some responsibility to maximize it, and it has shut down some potential areas of collaboration.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I think it's a great point. And, there's, that collaboration on those biggest, toughest problems, that's where we really, can make a big difference, right?
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about how sort of the embarrassment of some of the protection gap with recent events, and finding ways to unlock that is important. But one of the things you said within that, though, that I think is worthwhile on the path towards how we start to get better at it. So absent, or right now, there's a reluctance to sort of better share the different pieces. Some of it is also just about getting better at using what you have, right? And so, I know, clearly that's been something you've taken to another level and advanced. So, what are some of the things you've done sort of within your organization that others could actually, at least within the walls, and then we'll open it up. How do we get better, or what opportunities exist there?
Yeah, it's well, I'll do it quickly because there are other so this is getting a bit more operational, but I'd start with it's almost a cultural mandate that the physical assets, and I'll talk about Aon. We have better insight and we have better categorization, and we can count up how many chairs are in our offices and every dollar we track. If data is really the new oil, we have no idea where all our data is, right? It's owned by different practices, owned by different people. Philosophically, almost a cultural issue, a mindset issue, is that asset has to be accounted for in a different way. It isn't owned by an individual or a practice or an office. And so I'd say the first starting point is a mindset difference. You need to just talk about it in a different way. That has taken a long time to do. Then you need to have a way to organize it in a way, and we're quite distributed. We're in 120 countries. It's actually not so easy to link it all together. There's a technical issue there, but we'll make progress on that, and that's where InsurTech is helping. And the third is an incentive issue. So there's a cultural issue, mindset issue, there's a technical issue, and there's an incentive issue because sharing even within an organization implies there's kind of a balance of power. There's something that's what's in it for me, and there's sort of structural issues we have to resolve. And so my suggestion is if you are going to make the most of your data, monetize your data, you have to go at all three of those. There's a governance structure, innovation, incentive piece, there's a technical piece, and there's a mindset piece with language and how you talk about it. And I think a lot of companies, I just told our story, a lot of companies are getting a lot better at this. But again, I'll repeat what I said before, is we'll all get incrementally better if we do this. if we're going to go after the biggest problems that society faces, we've got to go beyond our boundaries, and they're the challenges that are a bit more complicated.
So when we look at, so continuing on sort of this theme of sort of the importance of innovation in the information space, I mean, Will, like sort of underpinning a lot of what's making sort of your new, you have a new business model, sort of a new structure for facilitating these things, but a lot of this gets at what's sort of made that possible, and what are some of the interesting things you've sort of seen, and I know you engage a lot with other InsurTech players, not just yourself.
That's
that
right.
space.
I think that's an important feature of what's going on with innovation is you look at all the InsurTechs out there. There's not a single one who's trying to replicate the full stack insurance or reinsurance carrier, right? That's no one is trying to do that. Instead, many of them are looking at products or processes, or in our case, kind of a marketplace or a way to attach risk to the right capital base to bear it. And all of these have a role to play, and frankly are opportunities for the reinsurance industry to actively partner with InsurTech startups and think about how the capabilities and the technologies that are being created and kind of made digitally available could be used in your operations as a reinsurer, and that's the real win here is creating those partnerships and ways to do business more efficiently and ultimately be able to attack problems that need addressing.
Yeah, and so each of you have engaged a number of players and are sort of participating in it. And I know in the audience that a number companies as I showed earlier have been involved in certain ways, and some are sort of sitting back on the sidelines. So George, I'll turn to you. Like what are some of the ways in which how can organizations and how have you sort of engaged in what's happening? How do you keep up with what's there? How do what changes and challenges does that present in working sort of outside your own walls?
Yeah, for us, we take a position where, years ago, we used to scan and vet and look at startup technology companies, and the goal there was to see how their technology could help Carpenter, how it could help our clients, which are insurance carriers. And then if we liked what we saw, we would form a partnership or we'd take an equity stake. That's changed. Now what we've done, we've taken more of a position where we want to continue to scan and vet what's out there, but we do it through partnering, for example, with an accelerator, like a plug and play. So what plug and play gives us the opportunity to do by being a member, we now have an opportunity to see a plethora of startup companies all at one time. We can listen to their pitch. As a matter of fact, so will at Plug and Play. And then it gives us an opportunity to then say, okay, based on what we see, we like this particular startup. And since we like this particular startup, let's go back to Plug and Play and say, let's set up what they call a deal flow day, where we pick what problems we're trying to solve and which startups we saw that we thought could help us solve those problems. We meet with those startups, evaluate them, and then after we evaluate them, determine whether or not we want to form some type of partnership, work on some type of proof of concept project, so forth and so on.
I'm gonna jump to one of the questions here, sort of that came in, and I just think really hits nicely on some of the stuff we started to talk about earlier. So, what's your reaction? So, on the CEO panel, they discussed the disconnect between the capital markets' need for speed and the nature of insurance industry dealing with uncertainty. I mean, is this a sort of an industry gap that you can fill? Will, I'll go to you for this one.
Sure. So, Extraordinary Re's marketplace, just to focus on us for a second, has been created to be able to transact, in the reinsurance business, but also in the capital markets, and we internally can kind of make that translation or transformation. But certainly the need for speed, but I think in some ways, as important or more important is the access to more data and information and flow through information in real time. And I think that's the real process improvement that we need as a reinsurance industry that affects all of us. Is how do you tap into real time data, going down to to the seeding company, the policy, or even individual location level, and make that available to the risk taker at the end of the day.
So you're only further complicating our challenge. We got to be able to share it, and we have to be able to manage it and deal with it in real time. It's awesome.
What are we going to do next week? So I know you've got other questions,
No,
but
no.
I'm curious, markets require scale. So how do you create a deep enough market? How do you prime this pump?
Well, there's a large, $90 billion ILS industry that has come into being over the last 20 years, and talking to many of the leading investors in that space over the last several months, I hear from them directly that they want access to new types of risk. They want to be able to diversify their portfolios, and they've developed a very impressive level of sophistication and analytical ability. Through their participation in the ILS market, they know what classes of risk they want, and we can access it for them because we know the carriers and MGAs who are originating that type of risk on the front end.
Right. So, it's interesting. We talked a little bit about some of the partnerships, and you're sort of connecting with some players that may come outside of it. Talk a lot about information and potentially sort of the use of sharing. Obviously, also in the news, a lot of discussion on cyber and other pieces, right? So as information gets shared and things sort of outside our walls, things out of control. One question that came in here is, what would be your company's response if your data was breached and made public, which exposed your analytics technology to clients and so on? So, again, sort of this notion of you're operating with with different parties who, maybe don't have the same level of at least view of the rigor. Like how do you view sort of that challenge? And if you look at that question itself, what would be your response, George?
Well, actually, he is the CEO of analytics. Let's.
All right. Okay. All right.
Well, I mean, this is a serious concern. We have obligations to our clients. That was, I think, proprietary analytics, but there's fundamental data that we need to protect, and we have a modeling. We have an entity as well, impact forecasting. So it's something we take very seriously. So the value of sharing has to outweigh that risk. So we have to throw as much technology at protecting this, put all the legal protections around it. But when you sit down with a client and say, it's just like when we share our own personal data, it better be worth something. Although I heard people are willing to give away like their Social Security number for like a 25-cent coupon at Starbucks or something. So, but you have to get something of value, and it's that equation. So how would we, I think the question literally is how would we would take it quite seriously, and we do take that seriously. But the real opportunity has to be, you have to find a platform where the value created offsets the risk that come with it. You have to deepen this market. We have to figure out how much more value can we provide to our client, where just like we'll give away our phone number and our address so that we can get a 10% discount at some store. There's a trade-off that's implied there as well. I think the problem is we haven't had enough opportunities, and the fact that after data is the new oil comments started coming out, there haven't been this kind of platform out there, is that they just haven't been of enough value. That's the question I asked to Will. You have to get critical mass. It's almost in no one's interest to be the first to enter such a platform. You don't get the value until everyone else enters, but there's no way to compensate that positive externality of the first entrant. This is the opposite of the tragedy of the commons, which is negative. There's an externality of trying to do anything collectively, and we need to overcome that issue. And there is a technology out there that is way out there that could address this. We probably don't have enough time to address it here, but the other thing that you hear about is not only is data the new oil, you'll often hear is that blockchain will change everything. Now, if you're curious, why do you think blockchain will change everything? And some people here are blockchain experts and they may have an answer to this, but when someone asks you that, or when you think about how is it possible that something like blockchain could be as impactful as the internet, how is that possible? 3 possible answers, and 2 of them aren't right. So one has something to do with security, right? It's unbreakable, and it's this crazy thing that no one can crack, so there's some element of that. But if you ask yourself, is that going to change society like the internet? Maybe. The other thing is it's got this thing called smart contracts. So things could happen by itself. So you have a policy, your flight's delayed, you get $25. That's not changing society, right? That's like a macro in Excel. We have a lot of automation. That's not changing society. The real innovation and the reason why people say blockchain can change everything is incentives. Blockchain introduced a way to actually solve this network problem. It is a mechanism that will cure or solve the chicken or the egg. Why would you enter something where you don't get enough value until the 1 millionth person enters? So how do you get that ball rolling? And it's embedded in the philosophy. It's actually embedded in what's part of blockchain. But I'd venture to guess that when all of you sit at conferences and they talk about blockchain, they always talk about security, cryptocurrency, distributed ledger, tokens, identity, and all that's auditability of transactions. All that stuff's true, but none of that really is the answer to why will it change everything. And it has something to do with incentives to solve this problem of externalities. And we are going to use that as an industry. I'm confident that this industry is going to, this is the industry, again, that started with the original platform. It wasn't Apple that created the platform or Google or Microsoft. They all created platforms, but it was the Lloyd's platform, which is one of the original platforms. This industry will leverage this technology, not because of all those other technical issues, because we are going to address this incentive issue. We're going to tackle big issues around supply chain and other things. So again, when you hear that term, blockchain is going to change everything, just ask yourself, is it really going to be because a smart contract is going to execute something at a moment's notice? Right. We've got lots of automation, and that's not changing everything.
I mean, no question, right? I mean, it's a technology built for a world that actually does require that level of participation. It just needs some motivation to say, well, how does it actually solve that use case? And it's interesting because everybody comes at it as, what's a technology?
Yeah,
nobody got that excited when relational databases came. I mean, woo-woo.
This will change a lot of things,
but,
because it's an amazing construct, and it has much more to do with human behavior and incentives than it has to do with technology. It's kind of wrapped up in technology, and so it's hard to actually peer into what exactly is happening. But it's worth, so when you hear that somewhere and you ask, like, when you're reading something, say, do they really understand what the incentives are to create something? And that's why you've got these enormous networks that got created almost overnight. And it was the way, kind of the incentive structure, and they're innovating. So what's happening now in cryptocurrency won't affect us directly, but there will be other implications of this, and it's going to be fascinating how it develops.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. Do you want to add to it now?
I think you said it well. I couldn't.
All right. So
my story, I'm going to stick to it.
So this kind of goes back to even what we had on the polling question a little bit, but it kind of goes back into sort of the reinsurance value chain, and what part of the chain would provide the most value if improved with technology? I'll go to you, George. You're looking very reflective.
Yeah, there's so many aspects that I think about. Well, so I'll just give an example where let's take underwriting, for example. There's this approach now where carriers want to look at ways to streamline the underwriting process, and instead of filling out these forms with all this information, is there a way to just get, for example, a name and address? And then once you get the name and address, you're able to, through technology, pull data from proprietary databases or publicly available databases to then utilize that information, one, to help you underwrite the risk, and then two, once you underwrite the risk, you can then bind and issue a policy. So I think that if I see one area where technology can have a big impact, based on what I'm hearing and seeing from companies out there, that's one area where I could see it.
Well, I think there's a real opportunity for the insurance and reinsurance industry to rethink the sets of kind of processes and functions that are embedded within an insurance and reinsurance contract, and over time to separate out kind of the services, the origination, the underwriting, the claims handling, the loss control, the analytics, from the provision and investment of capital and allocation of capital to support risk. And by tapping into capital markets capacity, including pension assets in the trillions of dollars that have a much lower cost of capital than the typical equity capital that backs most insurers and reinsurers, there's a big opportunity to realize significant savings and ultimately to make the net revenue streams of insurers and reinsurers a lot more stable, which lowers cost of capital and raises ROE.
Well, and I think to some of the points we were talking about earlier, some of the panels earlier today were talking about sort of tapping into some of those areas where growth is possible, right? I mean, when we get into sort of the specialty and some of the more complex risks in the world, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of change that's happening, right? It's not, I always love the talks that we do on disruption and people instantly think of like auto, and that's just not so interesting. What is interesting is, and what's one of the panelists earlier said, he goes, what's really exciting, I wouldn't be in insurance if I didn't think it was exciting. What's really fascinating about it is if you look at all the changes that are happening in every other industry, that's creating new risks, right? And the question is, to what degree can we get capital and an understanding of those risks in a way that allows us to really capture it, right? So, manufacturing, moves from sort of the traditional to robotics and 3D printing and all new models. And understanding those pieces and seeing how it exists is a big difference, but a really challenging one. Paul, I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the manufacturing, some of these new areas. I mean, to me, this is, when I look at that front where they said you're going to get most readily disrupted, there's an interesting sort of, twist to that, right?
It is, when you think about, someone said with automation and machine learning, underwriters will have to do something else. But what is the something else? I assume there's some part that's true. That's been true for years as automation have been introduced to different parts of different industries. But I think for us there is a clear what that something else is, which is we have to. I think Kevin O'Donnell said well-structured risk matched to efficient capital. Right? Well-structured risk, understanding risk at that level, like manufacturing, when supply chains were getting tight when you had just-in-time manufacturing. Now we're getting kind of just-in-time on steroids, and then 3D printing is really changing the game. If you think about cyber risks associated with that and what the interruption is, and how do you maintain how do you audit something? How are pharmaceuticals, when they start 3D printing drugs and organs, if you really want to understand what those risks are, not just the tangible capital that are sitting on balance sheets that we're trying to indemnify, but the intangible assets like reputation and access to things, that's going to require a level of understanding about a vertical, a sector that I don't think we're used to now. And we're organized around perils and lines of business. And I think that we're going to see a shift to really understanding, if it's around manufacturing, things like the latest manufacturing technologies. If you look at new models like Uber, which is, again, another overused model. There's a lot of these things I think are overused, but Uber is a model which creates a different kind of organizational form where a few developers and a few marketing people apparently control 2 million drivers or influence 2 million drivers who are all independent contractors. Well, they have retirement risk, healthcare risk. Those are employees, they're self-employed, they're 1099 employees. We're going to have to understand those better. How do we bring capital to bear on the volatility that non-employees now face? And there are all sorts of new business models that get transformed by technology. So insurance will be interesting. It will never be boring because our understanding of these new risks that have very different characteristics than the indemnification of the loss of market value of a piece of an asset, which gets to be a smaller and smaller part of the economy. We will bring capital to bear on the volatility associated with that, intangible assets, and I think we will have expertise focused on these new verticals and new business models.
Yeah, definitely exciting time. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit from one of the questions that came in here. So there's a lot of advances that are happening, some in areas where the risk occurs and everything else. There's technology changes that potentially we can adopt and maybe use to better keep up with that, or to actually help fuel some of the growth for the insurance and reinsurance measures. But any concerns or how do you view some of the regulators and regulation potentially slowing down some of the technological advances? So, any thoughts on the regulatory environment and what that may mean in terms of as an impediment, or at least as how it may slow down what the progress or what's possible?
I think, what I've seen, I think that the regulators are actually trying to get together and do a better job of being able to respond quicker to some of these changes. You take the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, for example. They have a committee that's focusing on, technology, and they're meeting and they're having these discussions. And I think that before, it was a challenge. When you first heard about, 5 years ago, machine learning, right? And how did a carrier come up with their rates based on using machine learning methodology? And the regulatory environment was like, okay, we're not going to approve this because we don't understand it. It was done in a black box.
Yep.
But now I think the regulators are saying, you know what, we need to embrace this as well. And in order for us to embrace this, we need to be because I see regulators now at a lot of these InsurTech conferences. I see them on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, I remember they had a conference last year in Kansas City where they had a Shark Tank contest for startups. So I think the regulators are starting to get the message that they can't stop this. Companies are embracing new technology, so how do we make sure that we can keep up? Mm-hmm. So that's what I see happening.
And I think, we heard this morning from the CEO of the BMA, and some of us heard yesterday from the premier in Bermuda that there's a real understanding that technology is the future of the insurance industry, and wanting to understand what's going on, and subject to their role in protecting policyholders and customers, they want to help that happen. So I find that very encouraging.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of the innovations you start to see now in machine learning. So if you sort of really pick up on it, it's actually on how they're improving, how they can actually create explainability and sort of transparency into what those models are. They recognize that if we just leave it as a black box, you will inhibit any adoption and real understanding of it. So more goes to how it actually can articulate the complexity and explainability of whatever those models are. And I think it goes to something said earlier is if we only think of models as, the model will tell me the answer versus what do we actually learn to it, or the answer is always sort of it's and both, right? It's not sort of this automated thing that tells me we still must apply judgment, but can it help you navigate where best to apply that judgment? I think is when it gets really interesting. You talked a little bit about sort of the premier talking about things. One of the questions we have here, and it kind of goes with regulation as well, but clearly, given where we're at, it's what's sort of your wish list for Bermuda to have in place, sort of terms of regulation or infrastructure that could potentially make it a leader in helping sort of fuel some of these innovations that are potentially happening in our industry. A really different course, but it kind of goes into the how do we make this happen?
Well, I think one big advantage Bermuda has already is the regulatory climate here, and not just the acceptance and interest in technology and innovation, but frankly the fact that there is a single regulator across all of financial services, and that's I think that could be a big advantage as you start to think about new business models that may cross traditional lines.
Yeah. Anything else to add to that one?
There is a bit of critical mass that's needed to create that system that's in Silicon Valley, that's in London, that's emerging in Singapore. So I think if there's one thing, or there's probably several things, but the one I might focus in on is to get more startups kind of, there are probably students and great talent who are leaving to startup companies. I'd figure out a way to attract them, create some sort of mechanism with universities, and just create, I know there are some startups here, but getting a broader community where they can help each other and share ideas and then work with the community that's here, I think that would be helpful just to get to a point of scale.
Yeah.
I just want to, one thing I'll add though is one of the things that's starting to emerge too is you're starting to see companies and capital flowing into what they call regulatory technology or RegTech.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's focusing on the banking industry. So I'm wondering at some point in time, will you see that come over into the insurance industry as well, streamlining the regulatory process overall?
Oh, excellent. I'm going to ask one real quick thing, just because it's so much to the conversation we were having earlier. The question that just came in, we were having before our panel. How much are the investments in InsurTech driven by the perception of being left behind? We talked about participation. You guys are very actively involved in things, and we see both sides: those who get the most out of it, and those who are in the checklist game. Right? What's your view on where folks are, and how you'd recommend people position themselves?
You asking me or you?
I'm asking you right now, George.
Yeah, okay.
Those are your clients.
Yeah, it's one of those things that what I see happening, for example, is all of a sudden, and you know this story very well, you have accelerators in Silicon Valley that stayed away from the insurance industry. And now, fast forward to today, let's use plug and play as an example. At one point in time, maybe they start off with a few insurance carriers that became a part of their InsurTech environment, and now they're up to 57 partners. Now, all 57 companies that are insurance carriers that are now part of that particular vertical, they didn't all go there because they were saying, I want to be forward-thinking, I want to be a leader. I would say some went there being innovative, but most are there because their competitors are there. Most are there because they don't want to feel like they're left behind. Most are there because they want to see, well, what's my competitor seeing? And there are some companies that are there that are really, in my opinion, doing great things and saying, you know what, I'm going to invest in some of these InsurTechs, I'm going to do proof of concept projects, I'm going to, in some cases, maybe acquire or take a stake in them. But I would say a majority of the companies that I see that are in that space, they're doing it out of fear.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like most things, right? You see both sides. Those who are there and actively engaged, and their expectation and their objective is they're going to get something out of it. And then there are those who are there because they feel like they need to be able to tell their board that they're participating. And they usually they both meet their objectives. But maybe not much more than that. So in terms of time, I certainly I want to thank the panelists. I've certainly enjoyed all our conversations. And thank you for your time.